All set? Okay, well, I think we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This morning, AV Andrew Gini led a panel on regulatory and the advances in regulatory science and talked about how exciting that field is and all the development that is going on there. I think equally exciting and perhaps very appropriately following after that is a panel on commercialization because we are already experiencing some of our first gene therapies getting to market and a whole wave coming behind the first that are in market now. We have a panel here that is well represented of all the different aspects of commercialization, all the different stages of commercialization, and I think we have a lot to talk about. I should probably introduce myself. My name is Alison Finger. I head up commercialization for Bluebird Bio, and I'm joined here with 5 esteemed colleagues across the spectrum of commercialization. And rather than have me introduce each one of you, I think it would be great for each of you to introduce yourselves and also say where you are in the commercialization process and really what you're focused on right now.
Okay. I'm Andrea Hunt, and I'm with Shire. And for those of you who don't know, Shire recently acquired Baxalta, which is where I've spent most of my career at Baxter and Baxalta till now. I've personally been involved in cell therapies and gene therapies for the last 15 years and gotten through various phases along the way in terms of managing all aspects of that. So specifically at Shire today, the nice news is we have the combined competencies for both the Baxalta side as well as the Shire side, and taking a look at the role of cell and gene therapy across all the therapeutic areas. And we've got active trials, endeavors in the hemophilia space, as well as some preclinical activity in the CAR-T arena, and some other areas in rare diseases, of which Shire specializes in, where we're looking at cell and gene therapies there.
Thank you. Yep.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sven, Kili, and I'm with GSK. I head the Cell and Gene Therapy Development Group, and we sit within the rare disease franchise of GSK. A little bit of background about us. We've been in stealth mode with cell and gene therapy for a little while, from about 2010, with a collaboration with the Telethon Institute of Gene Therapy in Milan. And we sort of broke cover towards the end of last year. And we're very excited at the moment. We have a group of 7 indications that we've been working on, the first of which for ADA SCID, achieved marketing authorization in Europe in early summer of this year. So not only do we have marketing authorization, but we also have reimbursement for it in Europe. So we're really excited about that. We have another 2 indications in MLD and WAS, which are also very rare indications, fatal. And they are currently in final clinical trials and hopefully getting ready for approval very, very soon. And then those are followed on by a number of others that are in clinical trials in beta thalassemia, and then also 3 other indications coming on from there. So we're really, really excited.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Patterson. I'm the president and CEO of Audentes Therapeutics. We're based in San Francisco. By personal background, I've worked in the rare disease space for more than 20 years, spread over Genzyme, BioMarin, and Amicus Therapeutics. And I founded Audentes at the end of 2012, and we've grown nicely over time to a company that is entering the clinic in 3 programs. We develop AAV gene therapy products for serious life-threatening rare diseases. And we have 4 programs, 2 neuromuscular diseases, 1 cardiac disease, and 1 liver disease, but they all have the same hallmarks of being serious and life-threatening and very rare. 3 out of 4 have no available treatment, so my perspective on some of the commercial issues will be colored by what we do specifically. But anyway, we're excited to be going into the clinic. So we're on the earlier stage, of course, of the commercial paradigm, but frankly, because of what we do specifically and hopefully the pace at which we'll be able to get these products approved to patients, we're already thinking a lot about these issues, and so hopefully can add a helpful perspective.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sue Washer, and I'm the CEO of AGTC, and we're developing a suite of programs within Orphan Ophthalmology. So we have 2 products in the clinic and 2 about to enter the clinic. And my background is I have been in the gene therapy, AAV gene therapy space for over 15 years, so seen a lot of changes as the industry and the technology has developed. And really what we would like to bring to the conversation is that commercialization is more than just pricing, and there's a lot of different aspects that you need to have under control as you push your products into late-stage development.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beth White. I head up our early commercial development efforts for rare disease and gene therapy at Pfizer Innovative Health. And Pfizer's been building our capabilities in gene therapy over the last several years. We have a partnership with Spark Therapeutic for a phase 2 hemophilia B gene therapy program. We've been building our internal capabilities. We have what we call the Genetics Medicines Institute in London, where we're working on our own technologies. Recently, you may have heard we acquired Bamboo Therapeutics in North Carolina, which really brings some great scientific expertise, vector technology, and really high-yielding manufacturing capabilities. So we continue to build out our portfolio and our capabilities with a lot of focus in hematology and the neuromuscular areas.
Great. Well, thank you all. And as you can see, we have a wonderful panel here and a lot of very broad spectrum of perspectives to bring to this conversation. And as you think about commercialization for these therapies, there's really a great number of unique aspects. And I'd like to work through 4 specific areas today. I'd like to touch on value recognition. And as Sue said, it's not just about price, but on value recognition. Also thinking about the care pathway as we bring these products to market, and also the unique organizational capabilities that are needed to bring these therapies into the marketplace and into clinical practice. And finally, if we have time, I'd love to touch on what we can do together as participants and members of ARM to advance these therapies and make sure that the market is ready for us. So I'd like to start with value recognition. And Sue, you said this is not just about pricing, and it certainly isn't. What are some of the imperatives we need to think about to define and support the value of our therapies to the different stakeholders that we think about?
Well, I think in this day and age where there's a lot of focus on pricing, you can't have this kind of knee-jerk reaction about commercialization. How are we going to price this? How are we going to get a return on the investment? These are, in many instances, products that have been in development for years, and you spent the lion's share of a company's resources on them, and you want to see that there's a return. But I think the real focus needs to be on what is the patient benefit? What is the societal benefit of this brand new technology that you're bringing forward? And how can we develop these products through clinical development, through manufacturing optimization, such that we're maximizing the value to the patients, and then over time being able to then, by default really, get value back into your company. And if you think about the value to the patient, it can't be just incremental. And you're not going to get maximal pricing over time if you're only making an incremental change. But that's not what we're here for in the cell and gene therapy space. We're talking about innovative change and maximal change. And so to develop the data that you need to prove that value and to show that value, whether it be durability from a one-time injection, whether it be, in our case, making blind men see, or whether it's life-saving treatments like Matt's talking about or like GSK, you need to develop the data set not just for regulatory approval, but the data set to show the other stakeholders in the industry, such as the payers and the governmental agencies, what is the value to the patient and the value to society.
Great. Thank you. Beth, do you want to add to that?
I was just going to add, when I think about what's the biggest value challenge in gene therapy, I think it really is, the promise of gene therapy is that, we expect it to last for a very long time, and we expect it to offset healthcare costs in the long term. But our ability to show that in clinical trials is going to be very limited. Yeah. And, our engagement with the healthcare system is going to happen, for a very brief time at the very beginning. One-time treatment. So, I think we're going to have to be really very creative and work across all the stakeholders to really figure out how to fill that gap. And, think about a way that we can make it a win-win situation, in terms of showing that value across all the stakeholders. So that includes the patients and the payers and the industry and the healthcare providers. Yeah.
So, another part of this is just the funding pathways when you think about what's ahead for people making reimbursement decisions for our kinds of therapies. And with that and the other challenges, I guess I'd like to ask Sven, what is your company doing differently to address these kinds of challenges?
Yeah, that's a long answer.
Yeah.
I think, I'd just like to very much echo what Sue and Beth have already said. It's about creating value, so it's not about what are you charging, how much can you get reimbursed, but that's really what comes at the end of it. And so what we did was we really looked and we said, right, we've got this indication. It is very rare, but what we've seen is it makes a phenomenal difference to these kids. In fact, it seems to save their lives. So the kids with ADA SCID don't tend to live past the age of 2 without major therapy, and most of the therapy that they're able to get in unmatched bone marrow donors and enzyme replacement just doesn't really work very well. And so we were able to offer them a therapy that looks like it is going to last for a very, very long time. And to Beth's point, we've only got up to 15 years follow-up, so we don't really know what happens after 16 or 30 or 60 or 90 years. And so we've got no reason to believe it's going to be any different than what it is, but we still had to have those discussions. And so it was about engaging with the payers, the reimbursement agencies in all of the countries and the regions, and really sitting down with them and saying, look, this is a totally new paradigm. This is not a therapy where it's a little pill that's given once a day, once a week, once a month, once a year, once every 2 years. This is a one-off therapy. And if we take the combined costs of a bone marrow transplant and enzyme replacement potentially for the rest of the patient's lives, and you add all of that up, which is sort of the old way often people started thinking about it, it came to an incredibly large number. And that's fine for 1 and 2 patients, but once you get into 10, 15, 20, 100, 1,000 patients, it's just not practical. So we kind of went back to the drawing board and said, right, what are we doing here? How are we creating this value? And how are we creating the value for the patients, for the payers, for the parents, for the healthcare providers, and also for the shareholders, because we can't forget the shareholders. And so we went and spoke far and wide with people and said, how can we look at these different types of therapies? How can we look at getting them reimbursed? And we had the discussions, and everyone's heard it. It's the one-off payment versus the amortization versus some other mechanism versus a payment by results. And there's a lot of interest with payers and reimbursement agencies to look at the different mechanisms to be able to pay for these kind of therapies. What we found at the end was that no one really had the appetite to go into a multi-year deal to say, pay X amount over 10 years, 20 years. They just didn't have the infrastructure to be able to do it. But I think it's really important that we go into it. And so at the end of the day, they really came and they said, we just want to pay a once-off. So when we sat down and we thought about how are we going to actually price the product, what are we looking at, how are we doing it, we thought very, very hard about GSK's made a lot of commitments about making therapies available to patients and not making price an issue. And we've also stated very publicly that when we price a product, it's not going to be more than 14% of the R&D costs. Now, for an indication like this, that's kind of really difficult because we've invested an enormous amount into a platform. And so we've got a number of therapies coming off of one platform, so you can't front load everything. So we really had to take a step back and think, right, what is an appropriate cost? And we looked at a number of models to come up with it. And really came up with a number where we felt is appropriate. It's not cheap, it never will be, not for a long time, but it's an appropriate cost and payment for what the patients will be getting. This was taken to the reimbursement agencies and to IFA, and I have to say the discussion was very short and sweet. They sort of looked at it and said, oh yeah, very much, we were expecting a lot more. And so it was a very, very positive outcome. But what we've said very much is the amount that we're charging, we're not going to be making a profit on this first indication. This is an indication we feel we need to get out there. We have a social responsibility to make this therapy available to patients. And we feel by leveraging the technology, we'll be able to make a profit in the future on the technology platform, but not with the first one. So it's kind of a roundabout answer as to about how we looked at it. We looked at it from all sorts of different ways, and then really just try to come up with something that was appropriate but not ridiculous.
Great. Thank you. I do note that you said you only had 15 years of follow-up.
We're kind of proud about that one.
So actually, I want to turn to Matt and to Andrea just to ask, when you think about the different value archetypes and how we think about demonstrating value, what do companies need to do earlier in the development phase when they think about this? Either one of you can go first. Matt?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, we've taken the subject very seriously from early on. In fact, hired a head of commercial planning a year ago, and we're just now going into the clinic in these indications. But we take the issue very seriously and proactively in that we attempt to, number one, make sure that we're building in collection of data that we think will facilitate telling a very robust story down the road. So into our clinical development plan, ensuring that we are making it as robust as possible, not just to satisfy regulatory authorities, of course, but also payers in the future. In addition, we supplement with, I would call it additional quality of life type measurements and research that we want to do, some of which maybe resides in the clinical protocols, maybe it's outside that, but I think that's going to end up playing an important role, maybe not as much in the regulatory arena, but in the payer community. But both are important, and engaging in external conversations that I think are critical to us. Now, we happen to work in a very unique space, right, of these ultra orphans, but we liaison early on and have, since day one of the company, with patient organizations, key opinion leaders who see these patients, and the payer authorities to the degree that it's possible. And for example, we're taking advantage of the opportunity to interact with NICE with an early dialogue. We're not even in the clinic, but we wanted to talk to them right now about our vision for the trials to see if they have any suggestions on how to make it as strong as possible. So those are some of the things we try to do. We're doing at a very early stage that hopefully land us in a very productive place when it's time to talk actual pricing of the product.
Great. Andrea?
Yeah, so for our gene therapies, they're often part of the next generation product portfolio for the patients. And obviously, as we try to look at new product developments, looking at therapies that are going to have a significant difference in terms of outcomes for those patients over time. And gene therapy obviously is one that we all know has the promise of the cure, which yesterday I was listening to one of the talks here where I think one of the fellows was saying the only place where cure has taken place is actually in infectious disease. So it's a real paradigm shift in terms of how every stakeholder is going to have to think about a gene therapy. And we look at it as a disruptive technology. We've talked about that a lot. And as you think about all the different stakeholders, the patient themselves, the physician, the regulatory agencies, the payers, and of course the politicians as well along those lines, everyone is going to have to look at this as something very different than how they've done it before. So internally, what we try to do is think about this and manage it as something very different from the core. Because we have a lot of history in how things are done today, and many things are set up along those lines. And so we really try to work with the core team and the representative functions that are represented across the core team of the development process to have them think about this in terms of this really being disruptive and how we're going to have, to shape things moving forward. And it requires a lot of education internally as well as externally, and to try to have that headset on. So I'm going to kind of say it pervades the whole organization or the team around how we're going to try to think about gene therapy differently.
Great. Thank you.
I'm just going to add one thing. Sorry to jump in, but one of the special things about working in the ophthalmology space is, especially in orphan ophthalmology, where these are people that have genetic deficiencies, so they're blind since birth. And when you think about approaching payers about blind patients, payers are like, yeah. So I look up and I don't spend any money on blind patients, and that's because they don't. They don't reimburse for glasses. They don't reimburse for canes. They don't reimburse for seeing eye dogs. So when you think about traditional payers, they don't have any costs associated with these patients. So I think you need to think about, if you're working in a rare disease space, you need to think about, is there anything that you can compare to? And if you're in the situation like working in Orphan Eye, you have to think about that it's not some product that you've got to educate about what are the differentiations from a product. And it probably seems obvious to everyone if you make a blind man see that creates value, but you still have to have the data. And there's not even been any health economic studies done in genetic causes of blindness, only in the AMD space, which happens much later in life. So you could be in a situation where you have to develop the primary data on health economics. And if you're in that kind of space, it's not too early to start doing that at the preclinical stage, because it's going to take you a significant period of time to develop the methodologies, to gather the data, to analyze the data, iterate on it with potential payers and governmental agencies. So, when gene therapy is going to be broadly applicable to a wide range of rare diseases, but they may be diseases where you're going to have to start from scratch on your primary data.
That's a really good example. I've heard you talk a lot. That light bulb's never gone off about insurance, what insurance might not pay for a blind person, which is like sort of mind-numbing. But it's a good example of every program is unique. Every situation is unique. And as much as we talk about approaches that may be generally applicable to all of us, it really is unique in each case. Each company, GSK may take a different perspective than Audentes Therapeutics, and each disease has its own unique characteristics. So we also work on a rare disease, but in mild-tubular myopathy, kids are on ventilators, they're in wheelchairs, and there's a lot of cost to the system as a result of that. So evaluating burden of illness, maybe it's easier for me than for you, but in any case, it's a good example of how things can differ, and it is important to find your own path, and I think that'll be true on data collection, pre- and post-approval, and presumably even the pricing approach that you try to take once you're on the market.
Any last comments on value demonstration, or I'm going to move on to another topic?
I would just say one thing, just sort of echoing.
Yeah.
I think it's really incumbent on us developing these types of therapies to really understand the disease that we're working in, understand what the impact of that disease is, what's the pathophysiology, what are the treatments around it. And I know it sounds kind of basic, but so often you speak to people and they say, yeah, I've found this great molecule, does X, Y, and Z. But we really need to understand a lot more around it. And for these types of therapies, we need to understand the implications, just as Sue's already mentioned, specific to those types of therapies. And it's about collecting that data and understanding that right from the beginning. Because when you go and see NICE and you go and see payment organizations, the longer the data that you have, the more comfort they're going to have with believing you that it is actually as you say it is, and it works as much. So think about when you go first time in man, having that health economic data, start collecting that. What does it cost to treat these kind of patients? What are the hospital costs? What are the associated costs for pediatric indications? What is the cost to the parents? How many of these parents have to give up their jobs, one of them, both of them? Do they have to travel everywhere? Think about all those kinds of things. And these are things that we haven't thought about before, but it's really, really important. And we need to find ways to bring those into the health economic discussions that we have so that we're able to show that value, not just to the patient, but to the family unit, because that's what we're really trying to change lives around.
Great. Thank you very much. So in your answers around value demonstration, a couple of you talked about how disruptive this technology is. And you talked about, Andrea, you talked about how disruptive it is and how we need to educate internally. I also want to talk about when we bring these therapies into clinical practice, how much needs to change for clinical practice to be able to take advantage of them. And I'm actually going to start with Beth down at the end. And, you were raising your hand,
sure.
and then turn to you, if that's okay.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a great segue because I couldn't agree more with what everybody on the panel was saying about how we need to think about every disease individually, every disease and every asset, because there's going to be, different things that are going to apply to different diseases, and we've got to think about each one. And when you ask about the care pathway, so for example, one thing we're thinking about, of course, is hemophilia. And that's going to be very different from a lot of other orphan diseases that really have, no treatments in terms of what's going to happen in the care pathway. So if you look at hemophilia, here's a place where you actually do have good drugs that are helping patients manage their disease. And patients are very used to that. Severe patients use replacement factor on a prophylactic basis, multiple times a week. They're seeing their healthcare provider on a regular basis. Healthcare providers, build their business around that. If you think about the business model and what incentivizes physicians, and they, see their patients on a regular basis and expect that to happen. Payers know how much they're spending on given patients for their factors. They probably pretty much know that because they only have a few of those patients in their plans. And when gene therapy comes in the mix, of course, the hope is that you treat them one time and they no longer have to think about managing their disease. So patients should hopefully have a life where they're not worried about, what are my activities today because I didn't take my prophylaxis in the last couple of days. And so it's gonna really disrupt the whole way that, the whole environment works around hemophilia. On the other hand, though, I think what we also have to think about as we manage that is that even though, the hope is for the one-time therapy, we're gonna need to follow those patients for a long time because we're gonna need to continue to build the evidence base that's going to help people understand the long-term benefits. So how do we manage that into the patient flow in the longer term? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Andrea.
So obviously we're in hemophilia as well, and I think the model will definitely change, but not everyone's going to go into a gene therapy. It may be one of their options that they have, and I think it'll be interesting as these therapies coexist together, and there will still be the need for someone to take factor with hemophilia for instances where a surgical procedure is needed, a dental procedure, so on and so forth. So the models are going to have to actually coexist, and I think in dealing with the stakeholder of the clinician, they're not geneticists. They need to be educated in terms of what is gene therapy. And it starts with obviously folks who are part of the clinical trials, but as that expands and they become spokespersons for others, you kind of get that education piece going. But I would say that, for us, we try to work with these stakeholders early on to start that education process, and then work with them to understand the impact of how a gene therapy will be upon their practice, or in their dealing with, the reimbursement or the carriers or those kinds of things. Because those clinicians, it's a lifelong disease, have relationships. They're like family to those patients over time. So it's really important for us to work early on with our key stakeholders and to work with them to help them articulate the changes that they're going to need and help them with that.
And could you talk a little bit about the breadth of the stakeholders that you need to think about when you think about these disruptive care pathways?
I think Beth was talking about, but the clinicians, they run clinics where really the product is part of their portfolio and how, they actually survive. Yeah. That is one group. We've obviously got the patient and their families. It's a hereditary disease, so just the whole impact on, if I do this, the rest of my family or the other members of the family, et cetera, are going to be pretty key and important. And so there are organizations like WFH, World Federation for Hemophilia, that we work with to help them start to bring that into play and to have them, start their own education process with the community. And of course, working with the regulatory agencies and the payers as well. So having advisory boards, those kinds of things are all things that we're doing.
So just a lot of people to be thinking about and working with very early on. I guess, Sven, if you could compare and contrast the launch of your company with Stromfelis versus other products that you've brought to market and what you had to do to bring that therapy to market.
Yeah, thank you. So a little bit of history is before joining GSK, I led the clinical development for cell therapy and regenerative medicine for Genzyme, and so developed and launched MACI in Europe as the first combined ATMP, and looked after CAR T-cell, Epicell. So if I take Stromvelis and compare that to something like Macy, which we launched in Europe, so two European launches. I think first the similarities, and the one big similarity, and just listening to everyone talking here, is very often these cell and gene therapies are like, we talk about it Marmite in Europe, and those of you that don't know what Marmite is, it's like Vegemite. Either you love it or you hate it. And when you go and speak to clinicians, they're very much like that. Either they've drunk the Kool-Aid or they haven't. And so you often going to these guys that are really, really passionate about it. And so, I've never felt that there's a big need to have this massive sales team like Big Pharma has with small molecules. You don't need all these salespeople going out and peddling this type of therapy, because the clinicians are coming to you asking for it. They're really excited about this technology. The patients are even coming to you and they're asking for it. And so I think our job is to manage that expectation, because at the end of the day, not every patient is going to be amenable. And we need to be able to set that expectation, but we need to be able to educate the clinicians, the patients, the payers, the regulators. Think about the regulators, some of these amazing technologies we're developing. The regulators are learning with us, and it behooves us to take them on that journey with us and let them learn with us. So we've got an enormous amount of education to do. So if I go back to just the launch, there's a real need to be able to ensure that these therapies are applied appropriately. So the correct patients are chosen. They're screened appropriately. These are the patients that you have the most amount of comfort that are going to get a really good result. And then make sure that the clinicians are appropriately trained. And it's not just the surgeon, the hematologist, the transplanter, the immunology person. It's the entire team that manages that patient. They need to understand what this therapy is. And then it's educating the patients. And most of us are in relatively rare disorders where it's really important that the patients understand this therapy that's being given to them, what the shortcomings are, what the benefits are, and what it's going to offer them. And when it's not working, if it's not working, and the adverse events, that they report those, because we're learning all the time. And so that education becomes extremely important. And so what we found is that being able to go out and educate people about administering these therapies, following them up. And the other big thing is, we're talking a lot of gene therapies here. We are making a permanent change in a patient's genome. And that's pretty cool stuff. That's sort of Space Odyssey 2001. Really exciting. But people get nervous about it. There's a lot of nervousness. And I'll give you an example. We had a patient group come in and talk to our team and kind of educate them and really tell us what it's like from a patient's perspective. And this woman who runs this patient group is actually a pediatrician, and she's treated patients, and she's now the parent of a child with one of these rare diseases. And this child was offered gene therapy, and her husband will not let the child have the gene therapy. This child's dying. And the husband doesn't want this child to have gene therapy because he's read the headlines 10, 15 years ago that gene therapy causes cancer, malignancies, it's the devil's tool, whatever. And it's really, really tough because we have to support these patients and educate them and let them know what the risks are, because what we're doing is not without risks. We've seen fantastic results, but we've also seen some pretty catastrophic failures, and we've seen some people do some fairly dangerous things out there. And we need to take responsibility for that and educate people and tell them the good and the bad. So for me, it's very much about education. It's about setting expectations, and then it's about following up. And one of the big things that we've committed to do is 15-year follow-up on all the patients that we're treating. And that's no mean feat. If you're talking about treating a patient that's 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, it's really easy to follow them till they're about 10 or 11 because the parents slap them around the ears. But if you're giving them, as we're talking about potentially a cure, once they become a teenager, they become a totally different species. And they don't go to the doctor. Why do they want to go to the doctor? We had a little boy that was also interviewed that had gene therapy, I think it was 5 years before. And the interviewer asked, what was it like? And he said, well, I sat in a room and I played my PlayStation with my father. He didn't remember how awful his life was. He didn't remember being on the ventilator, almost dying, all that kind of stuff. So we have to follow these patients up, and that's going to be really, really tough. So we need to find ways to follow them up when they become teenagers, when they go off to university, college, things like that. when they don't want to admit to their friends that they had this weird disease that nobody can pronounce when they were a child. So for me, it's education, 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 and a little bit of dedication around that.
Great, thank you. I just want to touch on what you talked to, and you were talking about a little bit at the end, but on managing expectations on the other end as well, in terms of unreal expectations that some people have for things. And I guess, Sue and Matt, I'd love to hear your perspective in terms of education and how you see the knowledge of gene therapy evolving and how it has evolved and where it's going. I guess, Sue, if I could start with you.
Yeah, so I've been in the space for quite a period of time. In fact, I've been in the space in a period of time where you didn't want to use the words gene and therapy in the same sentence, and you would go to great lengths to describe your company and your technology and what you were doing without using the words gene therapy. And certainly that's not true now. And I think it's been because of the real hard work that's gone on in the industry, just being very persistent and getting back down to basics and understanding the technology and understanding that this wasn't as simple as it was first thought. When the gene therapy first popped out of the academic centers, everybody was like, well, we've sequenced the genome, there's a broken gene here, we're just going to plop in the correct gene and whiz bang, people will be cured. Well, we know it's not that easy, and there were a great number of people now who built the foundation of, okay, so we need to be very specific. What tissue are we going after? Which of the vectors, lenti or AD or AAV, are best for that tissue? What is the real clinical phenotype like, and what are we trying to accomplish? And I think that the what are we trying to accomplish, setting expectations, as Sven said, not every patient within a class of diseases is going to be perfectly amenable to having treatment. Potentially in a degenerative disease, patients are going to get to the point where you're not really going to be able to have the impact that you want to have. And so you're better, it would be better not to treat that patient potentially. It could be that because of some other comorbidity that the patient has, it's not the right thing to do to treat that patient. So going to, Sven's screening of patients. And so I think that just being as transparent as possible about what are the outcomes and what are going to be the constraints. It kind of goes back to basic clinical trial development, inclusion-exclusion criteria. I think we're going to have to be specific about that for commercialization as well, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, so that people won't think that every single patient with that indication is going to be able to walk in the door and then lead perfectly normal life afterwards. Because this is a very powerful technology, but there are constraints. There are boundaries to it. I have another question that I think Sven would be the best to answer, and that is about logistics, because we haven't talked about logistics, and most of us here are doing in vivo gene therapy, where it could be a vial and an injection, but that's not what Stemvelis is. And so the whole part of the value and the commercialization is putting that logistical pathway together. I'm sorry to interrupt like that, but
Sven, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I don't want to hog the stage. But yeah, Sue's absolutely right. I mean, we need to think very hard about logistics, and if you're doing ex vivo gene therapy, and you're taking cells out of a patient and you're shipping them off somewhere into fairyland, and the gnomes are doing something to them, and they're coming back. There's an amazing time when you really have to ensure that you've got control of those cells. And in the days of Macy autologous chondrocytes, I used to give a lot of talks to clinicians and say to them, you are responsible. This is a medicinal product. You take those cells out, you stick them in a little vial, you put them in a fancy-looking box, and someone in a uniform comes and collects them and takes them away. You don't forget about them. They're still your responsibility, because if they come back and you don't know what's happened to them, and you don't have comfort with whoever's processing them, and they come back and they don't work, or, goodness forbid, the patient has a really bad adverse event, it's not the courier, it's not necessarily the processor that stands in the dock in the court, it's you. you take responsibility for this therapy. And we need to take that very, very seriously as companies. Even though the clinician is responsible for the patient, we need to be responsible on behalf of that clinician for these therapies. And taking these cells and transporting them around the world is very, very challenging. The logistics that are required are, on the level of Amazon Prime and more possibly. And so I think we can learn from these logistics companies. We think we're healthcare, so we're special. We deal with living tissue, and the angels must all sing. But it's not true. We've got a lot of companies out there that are not in the healthcare space that have got a lot of experience, and we should learn from them and take those learnings and apply them to our technologies. So, what we think in terms of is we want to make sure these therapies are available to patients very close to where they live. And so we're looking at a number of hubs around the world to be able to treat those patients close by to their homes. At the moment with Strimvelis, we don't have that position where we only have a fresh product. So it's a case of the patients now have to travel to Milan to be treated. And you can imagine if you've got a child who's got a dread disease like this, who's going to die, who's potentially on a respirator, massive infections, and you now have to travel halfway around the world from, let's say, the US or Brazil or wherever to Italy. You don't speak Italian. You land at this dinky little airport. Your child is not very well at the best of times. You don't speak the language. You don't even know how to ask for a taxi. You go to this foreign place. The hotels in Italy are not quite the same as in the US. The hospitals even don't look the same. We have a lot of US patients complain that hospitals in Italy look pretty gross. And so, we're not used to these kind of different-looking hospitals. And so it's very, very challenging. And these patients then have to stay there for a number of weeks while they have the ablation and they recover from that myeloablation. And that's really, really challenging. And I'm not convinced that adds to the value to these patients. And so, we're very much working on making those therapies available to patients closer to home. And so that's very much a work in progress that we'll be rolling out soon. But we must never forget about the logistics. And it's not just the logistics of the cells, it's the logistics of the patients. These patients, for all of the therapies we've got, are very, very sick. They've got very bad diseases. And it's not as easy for them to travel across the state, across the country, across the Atlantic to get a therapy as it is for us to go on a junket or business. So we need to always keep that in mind.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I when I started at Bluebird, it was intriguing to think about the fact that the patient is part of the manufacturing process. And actually now I've turned it on its head, as you just said, that the manufacturing process is part of the patient experience, and it's something to really think about on that. I want to turn to just in terms of capabilities and what we all need to put in place as we think about commercializing our products. And I think I'd like to start with you, Matt. In terms of what are the unique capabilities when you think about commercializing these products and what you're putting in place in your company?
Well, the best example to focus on is probably manufacturing, and we don't have the same challenges that the ex vivo worlds do, that Bluebird and GSK are solving, but certainly AAV manufacturing is a complex and a very important issue for our field. And in particular, in the world that we are in, so we are treating neuromuscular diseases, and the requirement is certainly going to be that the doses are on the higher end, at least, of what's been used previously. And the state of the union for manufacturing of AAV certainly is safe to say in its infancy, scientifically. And so we've chosen to invest internally in that. And I would say it's actually the single most important thing that I learned from the start of the company, is how hard it is, how complex the science is, and how little experience and knowledge there was at how to do it at large scale. So it's a major endeavor for the whole field. And so we've chosen to invest in it internally, which didn't come lightly. We went through an analysis of what our resources were available to us externally and tasked the team with, if we could take a warehouse in South San Francisco and using some reasonable assumptions for our capacity needs, what would it cost and how long would it take to build out our own capabilities? Amazingly, during that process, a facility that had been used for biologics manufacturing in the past came to market, and we were able to access that. And for a much more reasonable dollar amount and time requirement, we were able to get it to where it is today. But it's still a major investment. We're a preclinical stage company. Investing in a biologics manufacturing plant was a big deal. But now we're up and running with two 500-liter bioreactors, and it's all support that large-scale manufacturing is supported by a very robust scientific organization that's molecular biology to study new and better ways to manufacture these products, analytical method development to ensure we have the ability to really understand our products, produce of the highest quality, and a foundation from which we can work with the regulatory authorities to improve the process going forward, which will be fundamental in this area, and a small process development group to help facilitate the whole thing. So none of that was a part of the vision when I started the company, but now it's the heart and soul. And it's going to be absolutely critical to our success in the future of meeting the needs of patients, even in these very rare diseases globally. So we're excited to do that and to be a part of an ongoing dialogue with the rest of the field about how to do it better and better over time.
Great.
So I would echo what Matt said, that manufacturing and analytics is really important, and I would probably stress analytics just as much as manufacturing, because when you're going to regulatory agencies, what they care about is the robustness of the characterization and your purity and your potency, and how you can prove that over time and repeating your manufacturing lots, I think is very important. I think it's very important to the field. And it might be when we get to the part about what could we do together, analytics, characterization, standards, I think are something that regulatory agencies are just crying out for us to help them with. And then I think the other thing we've all kind of touched on, I think it's important to point out, is the importance of having patient advocacy expertise within your organization, because we all know how important it is to have the patient in mind and to touch base with the patients, and that patient advocacy groups can drive clinical enrollment, they can help with regulatory advocacy, but you also want to do it in the right way. We talked about setting good expectations. So how you set those expectations, how you interact with them in a very ethical and frankly legal way is very important. So it can't just be done on the fly. You have to have expert advice on the best way to work with those patient groups.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add in terms of capabilities, these are obviously key. Obviously we've got to be able to manufacture a high quality product, and that's going to take a long time. And I think there's a lot of focus on that, but maybe something that people aren't thinking as much about in the early space, in the early time as you're leading up to bringing a gene therapy to market, is more what's going on in the public affairs realm. And the market access we talk a lot about, and value generation and talking to the payers and so forth, but there's so much to be done, I think, in in the political realm, in talking policy, in pressing legislation that might be important, and all those things take a really long time, and the communications around that. So I think that's just in the early space really important to start to get your head around and start to move forward in those capability building areas too. Yeah.
Which is a good time to enter a shameless plug for ARM.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Vice Chair.
As Vice Chairman of the organization. But look,
you up, Matt.
Thanks. We're an early stage small gene therapy company. We don't have the public affairs resources or government affairs resources that Pfizer and GSK have, and that's great. They should be doing all those things. But also, it's important that even companies like mine can have a voice and a seat at the table and legislative issues. The pricing and reimbursement discussion is absolutely fundamental to our future success, and so we're working with ARM, and I think obviously most of you are, but I think it's really important, and ARM can be influential, I'm convinced, in those different areas, and help set a great foundation for all of our products to ensure the best patient access possible. So I encourage everyone to get involved and do that, because I think it's going to matter.
Great. I want to come back to what we can do together with ARM, but before we do that, I do want to ask Andrea if you have other perspectives in terms of just even the basic go-to-market capabilities that we need to put in place, or unique go-to-market capabilities that need to be put in place as we bring these therapies into the market.
Yeah, I think we have all the right, functions and tools at the larger biotech, pharma kinds of companies that we have. I think it's just a matter of a lot more education, thinking about that very early on with all the different stakeholders, and to put money behind that to help enable the change that's going to come. And I think the magnitude of change required for everyone to accept a gene therapy is so much more than the next generation type product that does it a little bit better, a little bit faster, et cetera. And so those are one of the things that I think of spending resources early on to drive some of that education is going to be quite important. And then, capabilities, I think everybody's kind of talked about here, but really the skill sets of some of the functional people that you need internally to manage even outsourcing some of the activities maybe early on before you have something, proof of concept, et cetera. So that's another area from a hiring standpoint of making sure that we've got sort of people in functional areas that have that expertise. And so it's probably going to be a hiring war for certain capabilities, I think, for all of us to have that.
Great. Thank you.
If I could just make one comment also, and I think I echo everything that everyone said here, but I'd like to challenge everyone in thinking about this is a totally new area of medicine, but we've got all of the tools and techniques. It's just how we use them and how we leverage them appropriately. But I'd also like to challenge everyone to think about most of these things that we're talking about, these therapies, these cell therapies, gene therapies, are very much first world therapies. They're first world cures therapies that we're making available. And I'd like to challenge everyone here to think about how are we going to leverage these to make them available to third world patients. And right from the beginning is how we need to start thinking about it. How can we make them even more cost effective? How can we set up channels to make sure that patients in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in impoverished areas of South America can actually access these types of therapies? Because it's all very well looking after ourselves over here, but let's think about the patients that very often need these therapies even more than us. And so I'd like to challenge everyone to also put that extra dimension of thinking into your development plans as you go forward.
Great. Thank you.
It might make it even more possible in those countries. I mean, because now when you have to have a treatment every 2 weeks or every month for some of these rare diseases, when we talk about more kind of traditional biologics, if it's really just a matter of getting that patient one time somewhere, it actually logistically and long-term, even financially, might be even more possible than it's ever been to be able to address these terrible diseases in third world countries. But we're going to have to be very creative about it. But I believe that this kind of thing, where it's only a one-time treatment, really can make it for the first time truly possible for us to expand into those markets.
Okay, the last topic, and before we go to questions from the audience, is what can we do as members of ARM together to help pave the way for our companies as we come to market? Matt?
I already spoke. Well, I mean, I already said it, right? Getting involved. I mean, ARM has set up a structure with specific committees that focus on key areas that are important for our field. And I think by collaborating on those things, making sure your ideas are represented, because there is not easy answers to a lot of these questions, but hearing everyone's ideas and trying to reach some consensus view that best represents the interests of the field would be great. So participation, honestly. Certainly, I'm sure there are ways that individual companies can use ARM as a vehicle to meet and find ways to collaborate that could facilitate patient access as well. We happen to invest in manufacturing internally, but that's not going to be the right answer for everyone. So manufacturing and the operational execution side of it, I'm sure there's ways people could work together. So those are a couple of examples, I think, of multiple ways that we can work together within the organization.
I think one of the challenges is for people to figure out for themselves, and it's going to be different for every organization, but figure out the things that are your true core competencies, your technological know-how, your intellectual property, the things that make your company unique and are your competitive advantages, and be able to let go of some of the other things that aren't your core so that you can cooperate with others in the space. And not just go forward with the idea that every single thing I know and every single thing I do is my competitive advantage, so I'm not going to tell anybody about it. And I think that too often we're not willing to give up some of those things on the fringes and cooperate with each other that really will advance all of us faster. And so I think that's my challenge to people would be, think about what is really core and critical to your company being successful competitively, and then think about what isn't, and see if you can cooperate with other people on those things. Because I think there's a lot of things like reference standards, there's a lot of things like, characterization standards that maybe aren't your competitive advantage, and could help you and others and regulators get more comfortable with the field in general.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that, we have a lot of unique challenges in this space, and we really need to work together and collaborate not only across industry, but also across all the different stakeholders. And I think ARM's already doing some good things in the pricing reimbursement realm and thinking about ideas and so forth. One other thing specifically I might mention also is, we've talked a lot about education. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions across all of our stakeholders, misunderstandings, myths, people thinking about, 15 years ago and what happened and not understanding how the technology has evolved. And I do think we need to, continue to dig into what each stakeholder doesn't understand well and think about a common language that we could work together on so that we have a great way to speak to all those different stakeholders, which is going to be a little bit different. Yeah. So education, I think, is key.
Great. Any other thoughts before we go to...
Maybe just one other thought.
Yeah, please.
From a legislative standpoint, and ARM is working on this, but you talked about initially payers not wanting to pay for performance because the mechanism isn't set up for people to do that. I think as gene therapies become more widespread, we're going to have to figure out a way for that to happen. Yeah. And that's going to take some creative thinking as well as working with folks over time, because as the amount of gene therapies come into play, the one-offs are not going to be possible. So I think, I've been told, it's going to take 5 years to change legislation. ARM is actively working on that, but we have to work on that together, I think, as an industry and across to try to help to make that a possibility. That's at least my thought on, making gene therapy accessible for people.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think, to Matt's point, the larger companies, the Pfizers, the GSKs, we've got gajillions of people that speak to government officials all over the world, and I don't know what they talk about.
But good stuff.
And they can potentially make a difference and change the world, but not every company is a big pharma giant. And to be fair, cell and gene therapy is a teeny tiny itsy bitsy little part, and most of them can't even spell it, so they're often talking respiratory and other stuff. But we've got this fantastic group of ARM, and if we stand together and we leverage all of our strengths together, large and small, and channel them through ARM, I think the reference standards coordinating body, the education, the legislative changes, all of those kinds of things, the science, driving the science, the collaboration, that can all happen in and through ARM. And so, I think this is a great forum to have, and let's all use it appropriately so that we can all benefit from it, large and small.
Great. We have 2 minutes and 21 seconds left for audience questions. So does anyone have questions for this panel? I can't even see.
I see one in the middle.
There's one in the middle. If you want to stand up.
Question sort of for Sven and a little bit for Alison. When you guys are looking at you're tied to certain geographies with what's called a major socioeconomic and political issues. At the end of it, you still have to get paid. And so you guys have gone through all these great things, and Bluebird will go through them. But how does that factor into the planning? Because all these people who are still in clinical stage, this is something they'll have to think about, is some of these countries become quite difficult to operate in.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, some of them are more challenging than others. And I think it comes down to, a similar kind of thing about looking at new indications. It's learning about the geography that you're going to, learning about where are the patients, what's the concentration of patients, and then what's the socioeconomic structure in that country. And I think the way I tend to look at it is we need to develop hubs. And so we can't ideally have processing facilities in every single country, and so you'd end up having a hub that you can ship in and out of, and that allows the treatment to come to the patients. In terms of the reimbursement, that's often very, very challenging because even some of these in vivo therapies, even though they're substantially cheaper to make, are still a lot more expensive than no treatment at all, which is a lot of the patients that suffer these diseases have. And so we need to find different ways of addressing them. And I think every company has to look at that in a slightly different way. So GSK, being a large company, has been able to look at it, in its own way, in a very different way. And so, it's made a very specific decision that it will not enforce patent rights in third world countries. So all of the GSK patents for all of the drugs, it allows anyone to take them and manufacture them. We've also got processes in place where patients from these very poor countries that don't have funding, there are ways that we've opened up and been able to work with them to be able to channel them, to be able to provide that funding, to be able to go and have that therapy. So I think it's a matter of looking at all of these things. And other discussions I've had is some of the patient groups, particularly in the first world countries that have quite a lot of money, are willing to make money available for patients in the third world to be able to have therapy and things like that. So there are a variety of ways of looking at it, and it's just about understanding the geography you're in. So it's case by case.
And excuse me, I would say that basically holds true for Bluebird as well. I think as a small company, one of the things that we talk about and think about, and actually our strategy is to think about where we will first be successful, and where we can set up success as sort of a demonstration project to other countries and other geographies. And we all know that different countries look at other countries as benchmarks, and so thinking about where you want to be engaging first, and where you want to be kind of prosecuting your approvals first, and from a reimbursement standpoint, and then going forward from there. So you can't try and get reimbursement in every country all at once, and so picking the first ones where you're going to have the highest likelihood of success, and moving through it that way. It's not different than how you do it at a big company, but it's also obviously a question of focusing resources and making sure that we're focusing on the right geographies first, and then moving on from there. So a plan of action going over a number of months and years.
Yeah, we're out of time.
There's a guy in the back holding up a giant stop sign.
Yes, I know, I saw that. You're over. That we could see.
What was the question?
What are you trying to say?
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you very much for all your insights and wisdom.